Michael Osterlink here, and I'm talking to Alex Halderman. He's a professor of computer sciences and engineering at the University of Michigan and director of Michigan's Center for Computer Security and Society. His interests include computer and network security, internet security measurement, censorship resistance, and electronic voting, as well as the interactions of technology with politics and international affairs. He has done extensive work securing software systems, IoT devices, and some of the Internet's most widely used encryption protocols. Popular Science has called him one of the brightest young minds reshaping science, engineering, and the world. How you doing, Alex?
Doing great, Michael. Great to be here.
It's great to have you. So I had the honor and the privilege of having dinner with you. I think it was probably by now it's last month. We had a wide-ranging conversation. One of the things we talked about, which we'll talk about today, is the vulnerability to hacking of the electronic voting machines here in the United States. But before we get into that topic, you're working on a wide variety of really cool stuff. Can you tease us with some of the other projects you're working on?
Oh, yeah, I've got a million different projects going on. The core of my research really is about securing the Internet against all kinds of different threats. For instance, trying to make HTTPS, the secure encrypted standard for websites, stronger and more ubiquitous. One of my projects is something called Let's Encrypt that is trying to make it easy for every website to adopt that kind of end-to-end cryptographic security. I also do a lot of work in trying to resist internet censorship, and right now I'm working on a project to try to rewire the internet to make it harder for other countries to censor. That is, to make internet freedom, which is something that many of us value quite highly, accessible to people all over the world, and in a way that's hard for countries like China and Iran to block, even with the resources of a nation state.
Two very exciting projects. Love to have you back on and talk about them independently of this conversation, if you'd be interested in doing so.
Yeah, I'd love to someday.
Excellent. So we are in the spring of 2017, post-2016 election. There's a lot of hoopla across the political spectrum about elections and the vulnerability to hacking, some of it mythological in nature, some of it real and of real concern. Can you talk to us about your concerns with the vulnerability to hacking of the machines we presently have? And then we'll start there and have a conversation about what can be done to protect them down the road.
Well, absolutely. And yeah, unfortunately, there's so much political noise surrounding the question of election security. And that's really unfortunate because there are some absolutely dire problems that we need to address looking into the future to make sure that our elections really are things that people can have confidence in and that they're free from any kind of computer-based attacks and interference. I've been studying election security for, I guess, more than 10 years now, and I and colleagues have, in the computer security area, have been able to get a hold of many of the different kinds of voting machines we use throughout the country. And in every case where a U.S. voting machine has been brought into a security laboratory and tested in a realistic way by experts, what we found is just that the machines are vulnerable to many different kinds of exploits, that it would be possible for someone to introduce malicious computer software into voting machines and change the results. Now, we can talk about how that's possible. We can talk about what can be done to protect against it, but I'll let you lead the way.
So it might be a good idea to kind of step back and talk about the different types of machines that are now out there. Maybe even step back a little bit further and talk about why we have the machines we presently do related to the it was Gore v. Bush, post-Gore v. Bush fiasco.
Sure. So elections in this country, of course, are regulated largely at the state and even implemented at the local levels. So it's up to individual states, sometimes even individual counties, to choose what election equipment they're going to purchase. And there are two main kinds of equipment that we use today. There are what are called optical scan machines, where the voter fills out a piece of paper and that gets scanned usually right in front of the voter into a computer system. The computer makes a record of the vote, and the ballot gets stored in a ballot box. There are also what are called DRE, or direct recording electronic machines, where the voter just pushes a button or uses a touch screen to cast their vote. And then usually the only record of the vote is a digital one. Sometimes the machine will print out a little cash register receipt that goes in a box for later. But often the only record is electronic with DREs. Both of these categories of machines are fundamentally computers, and the result that gets recorded is the result that the computer records during the election. Now, there's some backstory to this, to how we got here. So if you went back to before 2000, there were even more types of machines, things like punch card machines that very infamously were used in Florida. During the Bush versus Gore election, we had really an electoral disaster where we didn't know the result of the presidential election for about a month. Because of problems with counting and then recounting these punch card ballots. They just didn't record the vote accurately or in a way that could be preserved and checked. And it, as a result of that, essentially national embarrassment of not knowing who won the election, Congress allocated a large amount of money to the states to upgrade their technologies. Unfortunately, there weren't good standards in place, so many states bought into computer voting machines that had gaping security holes that couldn't possibly be made secure. And the states, since that time, most states have not upgraded their technology substantially. The main change has been that in the early 2000s, most votes were recorded on purely paperless touchscreen machines. But over the last 10 years, because of research into the vulnerabilities of those systems, today we've gotten up to about 70% of votes are recorded in some way on a paper record that is going to be out of reach of computer hackers. And that's just an essential kind of security failsafe, having some kind of mechanism that, well, can't be changed by malware on a voting machine. Those records, as long as we check them to make sure that the computers are being honest, should provide a good defense against all different modes of hacking.
So walk us through the vulnerabilities anywhere along the path from before the machine is purchased, to the time the machine is purchased, to the time the machine is actually utilized, and then utilized every couple of years, obviously, because we have elections every couple of years, and the different points where they're vulnerable to different types of hacking.
Right. So just to think about the ways that voting machines are used in a typical election, the good thing is, the advantage is that a machine is not going to be usually directly connected to a network during voting. That provides a nice amount of isolation. But when you think about the way an attacker would actually target U.S. elections, they don't necessarily need to hack the machine during the time votes are being counted. And there are actually ways to introduce malicious software into machines prior to an election. So one way would be to attack the machines while they're being manufactured, while they're being stored. You can imagine ways that insiders in the election process with special access could do that. But we have to worry, too, about remote attackers, including powerful attackers like state-level attackers from adversarial countries that might want to do us harm and cause political interference. So those remote attackers have a very plausible way to penetrate large numbers of voting machines because our machines are programmed before each election with the unique ballot design of that election. How does that ballot get programmed in? Well, typically that happens using a removable memory card, almost like a USB memory stick. It's going to be put into the machine by election workers. That card, we found in research, can spread malware to the machine. So if the computers that are used to program the ballot designs onto those cards to transfer the ballots to the voting machines are not well protected, someone could hack into those computers and spread vote-stealing malware to the machines. Now, how well protected are these systems that are programming the memory cards? Well, let me give you an example. In Michigan, more than 75% of counties have their voting machines programmed by just 2 small businesses. They just outsource that function. And these aren't businesses that are have the profile of high security companies. They sell all kinds of voting equipment to the counties, and they're 10, 20-person shops. So typically counties will email the ballot design to these companies. They'll take the design from the email, move it onto a computer, and program it onto the memory cards, send it out into the field on election day. That provides a surprisingly centralized and potentially vulnerable route that has really been under the radar for most people. Even in the election business, people haven't been paying attention. So if you think about the ways that we've seen state-level malware, nation-state malware, spread in sophisticated attacks before, something like Stuxnet, which is reportedly an example of a sabotage campaign that, according to news reports, the U.S. and Israel conducted against the Iranian nuclear enrichment program. That spread in a similar way, in that it was designed to spread from certain places that were connected to the internet through removable media to special purpose computers that were isolated from the network. It's entirely possible that a similar attack could spread vote-stealing malware to the voting machines used on election day.
You said, as an example, in Michigan, there's basically 2 companies that do the pre-programming and then send out the thumb drive or whatever they utilize to the counties and such. Is that pretty particular? Is that pretty standard operating procedure in the other 49 states as well?
That's pretty typical, yeah, that most counties either will program the ballot design themselves using county computer systems, and you can imagine how well secure the typical county network is. Or they'll outsource it to vendors, typically these types of small independent businesses.
So the DREs are not necessarily connected to the internet during or after the elections, so they're safe from that kind of intrusions. But the county machines, or these private company machines that do the pre-prepping for the elections, most likely they are on the web or connected to the web.
Right. They're either connected to the internet or they're receiving files from the internet. There's a path from the internet to the voting machine. It just goes through this extra step.
Okay. And also, too, not only do you have the pre-programming, you get the thumb drive, you program the machines. From what I understand, the machines actually sit pretty much unguarded for long periods of time before they go to an election location. And even at the election location, it's not like there's much security, physical security. I'm not even talking about cyber security in terms of protecting them. I'd like you to speak to that, as well as what kind of training do people who are involved in elections get to look for any kind of malware intrusions or even physical security intrusions?
Right. So what you're talking about with the machines being left unprotected is absolutely true in many parts of the country. The machines, some places, are sent home the night before with poll workers who might potentially leave them unguarded. In other places, the machines are delivered to the voting location a day or so in advance, and that might be a local school or a church or another place where they're just open to the public. So in research, we found that even temporary physical access to a voting machine for just a minute or so could be enough to introduce malicious software into the machine. So when you're talking especially about attacks that could propagate from the local level, where just physically tampering with a few machines would be enough, that might be a way that an intrusion would start. We've also found in research, and this is something that I was the first person to develop in research, a voting machine virus that can spread from machine to machine automatically, and if introduced in just one machine, can propagate to all the machines in a county or sometimes even a whole state through normal pre- and post-election procedures. So that's another way that malware might spread. Just harnessing this power of computation that normally we benefit from, right?
Mm-hmm.
That computing is helping us make elections perhaps more efficient. But it can also be used against us if attackers use the ability of computers to do things like modify their programming or exchange information to hurt us, right? So typically, if you think about the training that election workers receive, there's nothing to do with the cybersecurity aspects. Maybe some state election offices have state security people available to them. But when you're thinking about the local level at which the machines are actually administered, there's just not enough election security expertise to go around. This country has many people who are well trained in election security, but it's still going to be in the, I don't know, dozens of people,
Okay.
Not anywhere close to the thousands and thousands of individual jurisdictions who need that specialization in order to have hope of detecting advanced attacks.
Well, first of all, I must say it's a good thing you wear a white hat. you're on our side. That's excellent. Can you speaking of white hats, black hats, who might, both state and non-state actors, have the capability to do some of these mischievous activities? Who should we, law enforcement intelligence, be on the lookout for?
Well, that's a great question. You can think about both state-level adversaries, nation-state adversaries, and advanced cyber criminals being able to, potentially able to attack elections today. We've worried the longest about just cyber criminals, about people who aren't working for a nation-state. And I think that attacking voting machines as their security level is today is well within reach of the kinds of criminals who, for financially motivated reasons, are doing things like botnet, scale, denial of service attacks, or financial fraud. It's not particularly sophisticated, the kind of security intrusion you need to do to compromise typical machines, especially if you have the cooperation of an insider or you have physical access. Remote attacks certainly are plausible too, perhaps a little bit more advanced because you need to locate the systems that are going to be used to program the machines before election day, and you have to spread an attack through them. But there are any number of nation states that have developed by now sophisticated cyber offensive capabilities, thinking about China, Iran, Russia, as just some examples. And that's a growing number of potential adversaries there. I would have said 10 years ago that state-level attacks on elections were plausible but sounded a bit like science fiction. Today, we're reading about nation-state attacks every day in the newspaper. This is the world we live in. And when you think about how close some elections can be, an attacker wouldn't have to target. There's not a central place in our elections where an attacker could target to change results across all the states. But in a contest, say, for the presidency or control of the Congress, where races in several different states together might make the difference, an attacker could choose to target a subset of those states and pick from all of them the ones that have the weakest security. So this kind of distributed nature of American elections in an election that's not close sounds like an advantage, but in an election that's close and hinges on a few states, it really becomes an advantage to the attacker. They get to pick and choose their targets.
So, from what I hear you saying, most likely in the near future, we're not going to be able to upgrade our physical security. We're most likely not going to be able to upgrade our cyber security on some of these things, just because of lack of resources, especially at the state and county level. What is the prescription to protect ourselves from these kind of possible future attacks? And before you answer that, it should be noted that there's no evidence that this has happened yet, correct? This is just a future problem?
That's right. There's no solid evidence that any past election has been attacked by cyber means. But in my professional opinion, it's only a matter of time until one is, unless we put defenses in place. This is a major vulnerability in our national infrastructure. But in terms of what we need to do, there's some pretty simple steps we can take. Yes, we should update harden the software in voting machines and upgrade physical security where we can. Those are pretty common sense security measures, but it's the same as other government computer systems that we need to be doing better to secure. But in elections, we have another and quite straightforward route available to us, which is that we're already at 70% of votes recorded on pieces of paper. We need to get that number to 100%. So we have some physical storage of every vote that's outside the reach of computer hackers. But more so than that, and really the major gap in our defenses today is that most states don't even look at that paper. Even if they're recording votes on paper, they have no procedures for auditing that paper to make sure that the result recorded there matches the electronic result. So what we need to do is make sure that all states introduce an auditing requirement, that they don't have to look at all the paper necessarily, but they have to spot check enough of it to know that the statewide outcome is right. And that is, to me, it's just a common sense form of quality control that we should be applying as a defense. It doesn't have to be expensive. You can look at a small statistical sample of ballots, of the paper ballots, to know that the electronic outcome is the same. And it's become a pretty well-developed statistical science by now, how you would make that sample, how you would do it. We just need to get states to implement the proper procedures. And once again, though, this becomes a difficult question because you're asking every state to make that change.
So before we jump down the audit discussion, to go from 70% to 100%, what would be required by the various states? What do they need?
There are only a small number of states that are still using purely electronic, no paper record machines. And let's see, New Jersey, Georgia, I think, a relatively small number. And in most of these cases, these states are already using machines that are nearing the end of their operational life. We just have to make sure that they do upgrade soon, and that when they upgrade to machines that produce a physical record. So that is the getting to 100% paper part. And we're not talking about a tremendous amount of money. We don't need all 50 states to buy new machines. There are just a handful of states that are stragglers. But then the more important thing of making sure that states are implementing audits, that is going to require states to make changes to procedures, sometimes that are enshrined in legislation in the states, sometimes that are just the operating procedure of the election officials. In Michigan, for instance, they do something that they call an audit after an election, but it doesn't actually involve looking at any of the paper ballots, even though Michigan is at 100% paper across the state. So in that case, rather than just have that paper and never look at it and eventually throw it away, Michigan and other states should, before they certify the election result, do a statistical sample, a small percentage of all of the ballots, pick them at random, and just have a person go and look at that piece of paper to make sure it matches the electronic record. That way, if enough electronic records have been changed that the election outcome would be reversed, well, we'll detect it. And the way that you approach audits under modern statistical thinking about this is basically, rather than fix a percentage and say we're going to look at 5%, 10% of ballots, you say we're going to start with a very small fraction and look at them, see if there are any changes, and keep looking at more and more until you've reached a certain level of confidence based on the results that you've found. How many errors, how much deviation. This is something called a risk limiting audit. So you pick a risk limit. That is, you want to make sure that there's only a 1% chance that the outcome is wrong, and you audit until you reach that limit. The really neat thing about that is it turns out that in an election that's a landslide, you have to look at very, very few ballots in order to get the risk down to that small level. In an election that is extremely close, which would, in most state laws now, say, already trigger a recount, then you have to audit more. But that is a more rare event, and the amount of work you have to do adjusts dynamically with how close the election result was.
Are there any states or localities that implementing what you're suggesting as kind of the model that we should be looking towards?
Yes, so some states have started to. Colorado is one example. I believe New Mexico as well, or is it Arizona? Arizona or New Mexico, I'm sorry, I don't remember which. This is starting to be adopted in a few places, but unfortunately not at a very fast rate. And if we're looking at the rate at which the space of threats are evolving, I think that by 2018, 2020, our election system is going to be on the radar of a lot of very sophisticated attackers, including nation-state adversaries. So it's important that we get states moving and provide them with incentives or resources to have good audit mechanisms and physical safeguards for physical evidence of ballots in place before these next elections. And before we're attacked, I really do think it's only a matter of time.
If my memory serves me correctly, the Congress appropriated about $3 billion for the states to buy these machines. You're talking about not that type of money to fix this problem. Do you have a guesstimate about how much it might cost to move from 70% to 100%, and then also add in the statistical auditing process?
Well, I'm not the expert on those costs myself, unfortunately, but I think it would be a tiny fraction of that. Since we don't have to have every state upgrade, and since these statistical audit mechanisms really are so efficient, doing a statewide recount in Wisconsin in 2016, I think that's a recent example. The cost there, I believe, was about $2 million. But that's for 100% of the ballots. If we're talking about just a percent or two, it's obviously going to be a much, much lower cost for the state to carry that out.
Right on. So you mentioned earlier that you've actually got to play around and put on your black hat and do some of these attacks, which sounds quite interesting and fun for you. Where can people learn more about some of these efforts that you've done? Have you written about them? Other interviews you might have done, so who might want to do a deeper dive into your thinking?
Sure. I can send you a set of links if you'd like to post them, and people just Google for me. I have my research papers about voting machines and voting systems where we found vulnerabilities all on my website.
Awesome. And your URL is?
It's https:// jhalderm, JHALDERM.com.
Excellent. Make sure that's in the show notes. Alex, great talking to you. Thank you for being on the show. It's always a pleasure to have these kind of conversations with you. You're, as it was said about you, you're a brilliant guy, and look forward to having you back to talk about some of your other projects you got going on.
All right. I'll look forward to it.
Thanks.